All right, Smithville Board of Alderman work sessions called to order. We've got 2 hours tonight, folks, so I'm going to let David kick it off and go, and he's got an hour, so if he ends early, great. If not, we'll cut him off. So, David, it's all yours, bud.
Okay, well, all right. Well, thank you, Mayor, and hello, Alderman. Um, I want to just run through about 20 slides just to give you an overview of the sort of context and the sort of content of the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. And then obviously you can either interject with questions or we can have some discussion and Q&A afterwards. I do want to start by actually just acknowledging that I actually think it's a fantastic plan and it's had a huge amount of community input. But I do want to call out Matt and Brittany, particularly from the Parks and Rec team, just champions to work with through this whole process and really got the community activated. And Cynthia, of course, your support always through these processes is invaluable. But really, as a big shout out to the community. I mean, we'll talk about the survey results in brief, but we had over 1,000 households weigh in on the community survey. And for a community of your size, that obviously shows that people are pretty interested in the Parks and Recreation story. And from our side, of course, Heather's Brannigan from Future IQ's on this call, and Carissa from Landworks may be joining us. I know she's traveling, so she may have some connectivity issues. I'm just going to share my screen and put up some slides. Let's see if I can make this work. So you guys should be seeing my slide deck, are you? Yep, okay, good. All right, so the context, right? So just a little bit of context. So this slide here, there's a few things we took into account in terms of sort of tackling the Parks and Recreation Master Planning and trying to think about, I guess, the sort of the velocity and the trajectory in terms of the plan. So one, obviously the population's growing, you're a rapidly growing community. So it's really important to take that into account because we're talking about a 10-year plan and the community is going to be different then as it was 10 years ago. The population is also changing. So the nature of who are the people who make up the community and their needs and desires is changing. The Parks and Recreation piece and trails, all of that is actually a really huge value proposition for this community. And that's really well acknowledged by the community. So I think a focus on this particular master plan was really good strategy and good timing, because I think getting this right and being able to give Matt the sort of railway tracks into the future really helps build a lot of value for the community in a larger sense beyond just the Parks and Recreation assets. And of course, you guys have triggered a funding increase through the 0.5% sales tax, which has really provided the momentum to have a pretty exciting conversation. As we tackled the plan in that sort of Venn diagram there, we were really looking at multiple impacts and outcomes from the plan, looking at the people, the neighbourhoods and the community impacts, but also the economic and business impacts. The recreation can be a pretty significant economic driver. And we've tried to tie that very much to the downtown economy and thinking about how those things can work in synergy. And then, of course, it's also an opportunity because it covers a fair bit of land to really think about ecological, environmental impacts and have that be part of the value proposition of the parks plan. So that's the context. And obviously, it's really in this story that your community is in a period of change. So we've tried to position this as a transformational plan to reflect that. But the starting point, to sort of like this is not bad news, but it's sort of the honest assessment from the parks assessment scoring. Really at the start of the story here is that the park system is really a fair score, like only scores on a fair level. I mean, there's some parks that are outperforming, obviously, but some are sort of scoring poor. I mean, those words are a little emotionally loaded, right? And you probably go, oh, I don't think we want to have poor parks, but it's really a reflection that some of these parks are really very new in their cycle. They're either just land that's allocated that hasn't really gone through a development process. Matt hasn't really got his teeth into them yet. And if you look at also the investment of staff and resources into the parks, it falls below the benchmark points. So part of what we've done in the parks plan is to really play a little bit of catch up, but then also look to the future in a fairly bold way and look at a transformational plan for the community. the community is dead keen on parks and recreation in Smithville. We discovered that as we went through this process. As I said, we had a huge response to the surveys, fantastic input into all the engagement opportunities we had. We had community surveys and discussion boards. We put some story maps up and so on. But I do think we got to the point where everybody who wanted to have a say did have a say. But obviously the community has a lot of interest in this area. And there's also a real reflection in the data of people saying that their needs in recreation and park amenities are increasing and they're going to be greater in the future. But there's also a very big appetite to invest more in it. There was no hesitancy. All the data points pretty much all the way through said people are willing to support investment in this area. And that's important because no point going out with an ambitious plan if you can't fund it. So the broad elements of the plan, just to sort of hit on that is, and I'm going to start to sort of get into the nuts and bolts of it here. There's a real focus in particularly the sort of early and middle parts of this plan, really around redevelopment of Heritage Park and Smiths Fork Park. And I'll talk about that because we see those as real game changers and a real way to sort of activate and deliver value back to the community. But there's also a component here of investing in the neighbourhood parks and starting to convene people who surround those parks to help develop local park plans, really making them the custodians and the activators of those spaces. Through the comprehensive planning process, this notion of a downtown community oasis, that sort of whole area from the downtown through to Smiths Fork Park, that really came out as this sort of oasis sort of concept. So we've really worked to try and enhance that. We've worked on this notion of a distributed recreation model. So given that Smithville has got, a very long sort of skinny structure, we wanted to sort of think creatively about how to create a sort of a nodes and modes effect where you have key recreation points throughout the community, but an ability for people to be able to connect to those quite easily and in a multimodal fashion. And this is where there's a fair bit of overlap here into the transportation plan that's starting. We introduced the concept of the Riverwalk Park that had an enormous appeal with the community. And also we're talking about beginning work on the community centre and the recreation hub. There's a lot of interest in the community for that sort of concept. It's really too early to do it because, you're just not at the scale of population and finances to do it. But it's a good time to start planning and starting to get the community thinking and moving and sort of organised in that fashion. Some of the other outputs which you would have seen in the report, but we also have these as posters, and this is the work that Carissa and her team did. And Carissa, I saw you jumped on the call, so if you want to jump in on any of this, say so. But we developed concept plans for this river walk here, if you can see that. It really builds off the momentum that's gathering in the downtown. We don't, this is not funded directly in the first period, but this would be a windfall opportunity, right? So, or it could be a partnership with a developer or something like that. But this concept and having a sort of a plan for the future use of this area, I think is really exciting for the community. We did a fair bit of work developing out the concept plan for Heritage Park. Really turns it into an important community space, connects it to the downtown and gives this sort of ability to be able to have larger events, more community gathering, it's got, sort of designs in there in terms of amphitheatres and recreation areas and, some small sort of modest sport facilities. But importantly, the trail system ties around the river, both through to the downtown, but also out to the lake. And I think over time, as this area gets redeveloped, this is going to give your downtown legs. It's going to extend it to the west, connect it out to that sort of space of Smithville Park, but also will, I think, give momentum to see then some things happen in the Riverwalk. Fairly big redevelopment we're proposing for Smiths Fork Park. So this is the sort of dam wall here, but a big sports concentration out there is in the plan. The community wants this kind of stuff and needs it because you've got such a strong school age family basis, but also a lot of people looking for sports courts and so on. So we developed that out pretty well. And then also had a look at this larger concept of a community sort of community center recreation hub, place to be determined, but really this is the sort of moonshot further out. We see this probably being post 2030, but we want to lay the groundwork for this in this plan. So those sort of concept plans are there, and there's enough detail and costing in those. So there's also a costing that we provided for each of those. So it gives Matt and his team plenty of chance to be able to sort of fiddle with those as resources become available. The other big part too, in terms of that sort of distributed recreation is, we have these sort of nodes, which is the downtown and possibly a community recreation hub in the future, Smiths Fork Park. And then really starting to think about how does the trail system tie all these together. And a big point that came out was, a real appetite people had for a north-south trail connection, east-west through downtown Smiths Fork Park, which is obviously well underway, but also really building the momentum to connect into the regional trail network. And so we hand off, in this plan, we hand off to the transportation plan to pick that up going forward. So into the details, right? So that's the sort of kind of the context and the story in the background. This is the sort of the nuts and bolts of it. There's really 5 key areas in terms of recommendations that are in the plan. And the first one is around boosting investment in parks and recreation. So I want to talk through some of our sort of formulas and metrics on that. But we are telegraphing or proposing a really significant increase in investment in parks and recreation amenities, supported by the community. I mean, they've called that out, saying that they're willing to support it. The program that we've developed is a $15 million plan over 10 years in terms of park development primarily. That's to cater for the demand, but also the big opportunity that you have. Trails and sidewalks, some of that gets picked up in this in terms of the individual parks, but it also, as I said, ties into the transportation plan. And a pretty big focus on thinking about how to raise that money, right? And I'll talk more about that when we get into the detail of this. But obviously, there's a lot of potential for public-private partnerships and to activate the community, which we'll talk about. The second big sort of bucket of recommendations is around the initial focus on the community oasis assets. This is the core of the distributed recreation model. So really focusing in on Heritage Park and Smiths Fork Park. As I said, we think they're the game changers, that if you get those developed and get those right, then everything else really cascades from that. But there are multiple dimension outcomes from those particular areas, both at the community benefit, the downtown economy, environmental capacity, and so on. We see the Riverwalk, as I said, the windfall situation, and then of course the Community Recreation Centre begin thinking and planning, but really not really telegraphing, sort of turning dirt there until 2030 plus. Tackling the neighbourhood parks, the small area plans. But a really strong point of this is thinking creatively about how to build the partnerships with other groups in the community to drive the economy, the culture, events and festivals in the downtown, and how recreation ties to that. The third big sort of bucket area of the recommendations is around activating community support. We think this is a real sleeper, right? That there's this community is so passionate about these facilities and topics, yet there is very little direct opportunity for them to be able to contribute to it. And we think that this activating community support is also essential to be able to achieve the investment goals. So a $15 million plan, 2/3 of that has to come from somewhere else other than city resources, and the community is the direct line, we think. So there's this sort of idea of a Smithfield Friends of Parks and Trails, people who want to jump in and be part of the story. Thinking about investment in grant writing and community organising, getting local groups involved and participating in the neighbourhood parks, getting some working groups stood up for looking at the community centre recreation hub concept. But obviously what we think is a really big one is the legacy fund and the revamping of that, to provide a way for people to be able to give to the process, and for the staff to be able to go out and the Parks and Recreation Committee to go out and fundraise to get matching plus dollars to make some of these things happen. And we think that there's potential. I mean, we're talking about a 2-to-1 match. That's maybe kind of sounds ambitious, but there's a lot of passion, right? So, and the time is right. There's a lot of money washing around the system. You know, every state we talk to, they're figuring out how to spend billions that are coming through. So you don't know what opportunities may be out there. The fourth big bucket area is creating the strong environmental, educational, and policy overlay. So there's a demand or a request in the survey data for additional educational and wellness programming. People are interested in the fitness activities. So thinking about broadening the lens of that type of programming to serve different portions of the community and changing needs. There's an opportunity for a parks and recreation branding strategy, we think, that would also be to tie it also to the downtown. So it becomes part of this big story where you're linking these key assets of the community together in a very visual way so that people know they're in Smithville assets, they're not in the county assets and so on, but coming up with a really nice branding approach that people can see, oh, that's where our sales tax money goes, right? You know, you have that branding and that recognition and you build that story. There's an environmental overlay here. That's a strong value that's really been expressed right from the visioning, that these corridors where some of these park amenities are often important environmental habitats and waterways and floodplains and so on. But also thinking really broadly about that in terms of, you know, even things like how do we minimize mowing, or how do we, don't overmow, moving towards electric kind of facilities or vehicles and so on, but really thinking quite progressively about that. And then there's a series of policy updates that are required, riparian buffers, trail easements, starting to build some of that in so that as developments occur, you've got all that policy lined up to help the public-private partnerships move things forward. And then the last part is the support for the Parks and Recreation Department's staffing levels. At the moment, it's 5. As I said, that's below benchmark. If you look at the sort of standards, it should be around about 7 or 8. So we're telegraphing bumping that up. And that's going to do a couple of key things. It'll help get a focus on and build the grant funding, so it should pay for itself many times over. But importantly, can also start to help expand the recreation programming that there's a demand for, but also to support the logistics as you go through park development. That's RFP, managing contracts, engineers, all that kind of stuff. So you need some capability in your staffing system to be able to support that. Just a couple of things to get into the money. So on the basis of the dollars, right, just so you understand that in terms of what we've been able to work through. If you start with the 0.5% sales tax, obviously not all of that necessarily goes to Parks and Recreation, but if you make an assumption that it could be around 450,000 per annum, and it's going to probably scale up a bit, it's reasonable to expect that will deliver about a $5 million over 10 years. If we do a 2-to-1 match on that and add 10 million through grant funding and activating the community and other possible support mechanisms, that gives us about $15 million a year as a ballpark. So what can we do with $15 million? Sorry, not per year, 15 million for the 10-year period, right? What can we do with that? Then we get to this point here where what we've forecast in the plan in this 10-year period, assuming it starts next year, an investment of about $1 million in the neighbourhood parks, right? So that's enough, we think, to get each of those parks built up a little bit and be able to give a progressive sort of development for those parks. Nothing too radical or outlandish, but something that's very empathetic to what people want around those park areas. But it's a way to be able to return direct benefit back to the citizens so they can see their sales tax going to work in their backyard. The big game changers, Heritage Park, we think is about a $5 million redevelopment based on that concept plan. There may be a chance to cut corners there, but obviously, things cost more at the moment and so on. But that gets a pretty fancy, and really you'd be really proud of what you got for that sort of money in Heritage Park. And then Smiths Fork Park is a bigger investment. We're talking about $9 million there. Some of these costs are obviously moving some of the sporting facilities out of Heritage Park into Smiths Fork Park to be able to redevelop those areas. But that's basically the $15 million in broad sense. And I'll go through the breakdowns just quickly. That leaves us with the Riverwalk, which we think is around a $3 to $4 million redevelopment. Again, that would give you a really nice area there backing onto the commercial area. We see that as an opportunity to accelerate on a windfall situation, or if things went faster or better than you thought, there'd be a chance to bring that into this development. And I suspect that you're going to get some momentum. My observation is, as a community, you're outperforming trajectory. Your population's probably going to be growing faster than the sort of the forecasts. There's a lot of attention. There's developer interest and so on. You have a lot of upside potential, I think, to have a windfall there. And then the community centre recreation hub, that's really a $20 million job. And so that's why we think that's what you plan for, but that's really in your next phase, 2030 onwards. That's where you're likely to get to about the population that you could start to support something like that. And you probably have got the systems built to be able to, staff it and run it and, have the programming and so on. To get into the nuts and bolts, right? I've got a few slides here I just want to show you, right? So this gets into the detail. This is in the plan, and there's much more detailed costings that have been provided. So in the first 3 years, the sort of short term, so we're broken into short, medium, and longer term. So 1 to 3 years, 4 to 6, and 7 to 10. So we're talking about investing in Diamond Crest, a fairly significant investment there to be able to build up some playground shelters and fencing and so on. Emerald Ridge, some development there. Some initial development in Heritage Park, a couple of shelters that would start to support some of the work that's going to be going on this year. Investment in the parks and trails, getting the branding and signage lined up and get some of that in place. There's a bit of catch-up work to do there. But then the big bold step in this short period is developing the fourplex baseball fields and associated infrastructure at Smiths Fork Park. So that allows that to get started and moves some of those facilities out of Heritage Park, which allows for the redevelopment to occur there in the next phase. So that comes in just under $4 million for that initial set of years there. So it's a spread, right? We're trying to spread some benefit to some of the parks that are underdeveloped, get some of the cohesion going with the trails and the signage and the branding, and then take some bold steps as we start to move into bigger investment pieces. The medium term, 4 to 6 years, again, some fairly modest investment in some of the, or in one of the neighbourhood parks. Some additions here to Smiths Fork Park in terms of some sports courts to get some activity out there. But then a big development in Heritage Park. So this is, the demolition, the site development, water features, all those pieces, the amphitheatre, the great lawn, the landscaping and so on, right? And that's a $5 million or near enough to $5 million redevelopment. So that's that in that 4 to 6 year period, right? That includes the trail system that will tie it right from the bridge right through around and obviously connecting to going out to the lake and so on. But game changer, totally a game changer. You'd love to see that happen earlier, but the problem with that is you have to move the sporting fields, and to do that, you've got to build some new ones, and that costs a fair bit of money and so on. But again, that could be an acceleration if things went better than we thought or faster. Just the key part of this, obviously, in that period is to activate the downtown spaces, and we think this Heritage Park, coupled with the downtown redevelopment, is going to do that. Then the longer term, the way this penciled out, starting to do a little bit of work in Helvey Park, which would be setting it up for a trail connection that goes down then potentially to a new community centre recreation hub. Wildflower Park, and then of course the big redevelopment at Smiths Fork Park occurring in that time frame. And that picks up on this whole notion that, you've got this, pretty exciting set of opportunities out of Smiths Fork Park. You've got the trail system that ties you into Heritage Park. You've got the potential for the river walks. And then you have Helvey Park, and then obviously you have this core set of assets here. And then at the same time, you'd be expecting the sort of trail corridors to be connecting in from across the community. So that hopefully then you sort of get this sort of vibrant, but just sort of spread out set of activities, but good ways for people to get there. And then of course, the big one that's out there is the community centre recreation hub, somewhere near the high school, to be determined. There's a few options there in terms of land that was sort of flagged through the comprehensive planning process and in the land use map of potential areas there. The south side of the community is a little light on in terms of recreation facilities. And if there's developments that go on down there, then this sort of idea of a community centre recreation hub, and seeing where community demand is at that point, big idea, but definitely we've got it pegged in there to start thinking about that and starting to direct the community energy that's around this topic to get good, smart people together to start thinking about how do you actually make that happen. All right, so they were the slides I wanted to run through, right? I wanted to just give you a sense of sort of where we got to, the logic behind it, what does it look like? Carissa, did you want to weigh in on add anything to this before I'll stop sharing the screen, sorry.
I think you've covered it very well.
Hey, so I have to step away for a minute, but David, I had one question, and this is for you and Matt and everyone. Hang on one second. So one thing I had asked about is having the revenue generating stuff done first, like the camping improvements to help fund some of the other things. Is that possible? And does anyone else think that same way of flipping that, adding additional camping spots at Smiths Fork to help fund some of those things? Or do you guys like it being last?
Yeah, so Chris, you jump in on this too. So there was a number of different options that were looked at for some of those revenue. So like low cost camp yurts and things like that, right? So there is the potential to do some of that, and I guess what we've sort of backwards and forwards a little bit about is, what are those sort of things can you do through, clever public-private partnerships, and some of the funding that's out there in Smiths Fork Park in the first period is for the sports or the baseball fields and some of the supporting amenities there. There might be some revenue off that. So we tried to design this, Mayor, so that it gives you some sort of guidelines of where to go and a certain logic. But there's a lot of moving pieces here, and at least what I've observed in the couple of years I've been working with Smithfield is that there's ideas and people popping up all the time, right? So we didn't want to lock it in too tight that those things didn't fit, right? So we want to allow the room for things to be a little entrepreneurial and things to be able to juggle around as interest and demand comes.
Yeah, I think the yurts is a great opportunity for community, to organizations who want to be able to build something. I get a lot of people approaching us, on different things, and shelter houses and yurts are one thing that's I think affordable enough, but impacting enough. So
yeah, and that's a big part of activating the community early on, right? Getting that community support, because we've talked about this right from the visioning, actually, through the comp planning, and we have chapters in the report about the economic driver that recreation and parks and so on can be. But Chris or Matt, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I may have, so we did move up those two shelters into the 1 to 3 years, because those were in the 4 to 6 years. So we moved those up based on that feedback, Mayor. But also the neighborhood parks were kind of one of those immediate needs within kind of the Parks and Recreation, with Diamond Crest Park having the splash pad there, but it doesn't have anything else. It doesn't have the parking lot, the restroom, the shelter, or the playground. So we thought to really develop that park to make it what it should be with the splash pad there. Those were kind of the needs we wanted to meet earlier, and as well as Emerald Ridge, the playground there is barely passing inspection. It was put in around 2000 2002, 2003. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but it's old and it's barely passed an inspection. So it was something we wanted to take care of before anything happened, and kind of that issue of Parks and Rec stuff. So.
So other questions or thoughts, comments?
David, you had talked a little bit about other communities fundraising through I hate the word fundraising, raising money, if you will, for these parks. Can you share just an example or two that you've run across in your career where they've been successful doing that in the community?
Yeah, so, and we looked a little at this too. So there's a few examples, and Chris, I invite you to jump in on this as well. So you have a lot of good local knowledge, but also I know Brittany's work. She has some firsthand direct experience with some of those elements of public participation and fundraising. So we worked it through. So if you and I'm presuming your question a little bit about is how realistic is the 2-to-1 match, right? So we did try and ground truth that a little bit. But we want to be a little ambitious on that one. But Chris, do you want to talk to that with some of your experience locally?
Well, I think some of the conversation that we had is that starting with these plans, once you have these plans in place, then you have the tools to be able to approach agencies who have funding opportunities. And we've identified some of those in the master plan as well.
Yeah, and when David and Chris, when we started this plan, one of the things they asked me was kind of, what do you want out of this? And it was kind of to get a project plan together with the sales tax funds, so we could go to those, apply for those grants, because applying for those grants, you have to have it basically budgeted or in the plan. They want all that information, so having that stuff scheduled in a plan is going to be beneficial in getting those outside fundings. As far as kind of like raising money, we, like David said, we kind of rely on kind of Brittany's experience. When she was at Excelsior Springs and when they were raising funds for the community center, they were doing local, events, community events that were bringing everyone together to do some kind of fund sales to raise that money and bringing in, somewhere $500,000, bringing in private donors. And so kind of that way is kind of the way we're looking with the legacy fund, is to, maybe put on an annual event that we invite the community out to, and really broadcast what our plans are. For example, if we want to put a stage at Heritage Park, we do some kind of event that really benefits that area and show really benefit overall what that would bring to the community. So.
Yeah, and if I can just add too, in one of the appendices, there's Appendix D actually, we talk about alternative funding sources and have a list of examples there. I mean, I do think it is a little untested, right? But I think it's worth testing what is the appetite of the community to be, participating like this, and what is the interests of legacy donors. So people who, you'll often see these days in parks, people bequeath, sort of assets for park redevelopment and so on. So we think there's a fair bit of chance there. The other thing too is that in terms of the design and the sort of the costing of the park redevelopment, it's pretty scalable, right? So we have money in there for an amphitheater and a pretty good chunk of change, right? So, but you can scale an amphitheater up or down, right? So I think we did try to make sure that there was the flexibility there to be able to produce the same kind of outcome, but be able to tailor it a little bit to what's the reality of the situation as you're at each point in that plan. And also that we try to design it roughly so that the trajectory starts off a little easier than as you get on, so to allow some time for momentum to build, right? But the principle in this was we really wanted to make sure that the community was part of this and that it wasn't just down to the city sales tax to make all this stuff happen, right? That if you have 1,000 households respond to a survey and they're ambitious about this, and this is part of the community value proposition, it's worth. I think it's worth pushing pretty hard on that and putting some effort in to be able to activate the community because I think you could get surprised to the upside is what our thought is, right?
And if I'll jump in just a little bit here to piggyback on what Matt and David have both said, one of the things as we as staff have progressed through development of this plan, and then even in conversation when this was presented to Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, we have talked about the fact that we have a legacy fund that has not been activated to the best use. So we will look to really re-energize that group and have some work both from Parks and Rec staff and then staff here in administration in really trying to recharge that, as well as we start looking at members of Parks and Recreation Committee and changing membership in that as we have appointees time out of that and appointments roll over. We'll be looking at folks who have a focus on Parks and Recreation, but also have some of those connections within the community and might be able to assist in some of that fundraising. So a little bit of a shift in the focus of that committee of an advisory board on Parks and Recreation programming to an assistance and a community presence in trying to help fund those needs.
I appreciate that, Cynthia. Bringing that to light. I think that's an excellent idea. And I'm glad that Brittany has some experience as well as Matt and David. I mean, that's the only way we're going to be able to do this is through legacy and through raising funds. We can't just rely on the sales tax. It'll be 30 years, it'll go 120 or beyond. It'll be way before, when we're gone. So appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think we phased it in such a way that if we don't get the giving that we need to, we do cut stuff back, right? So that's the way the plan's kind of laid out. Gives time to build up those annual givers, but also if it's really hitting brick walls and not going anywhere, there's a few things we can do like shelter houses and playgrounds, but especially with those neighborhood parks, but really not do the big swings.
And that's where you'll also see when we roll into the presentation that Stephen has on the CIP, as David indicated. David has spent a good amount of time with Matt and Stephen talking about the Parks and Recreation and stormwater sales tax. And through working with David, we've developed a plan that right now we have pots of money available on an annual basis. Then the recommendations from the Parks and Recreation sales tax slot into those pots that we have. While we don't have anything outlined as projects in the plan currently, that's what's outlined in here. And as the mayor said, then if we don't meet the fundraising goals, then we have to have those discussion of do we continue down this road or what do we look at as far as priorities? So we know what we have slotted for community investment and what we need for donation. So Mayor, I'm going to jump in and take silence. Are there other questions for David? If not, I want to thank David and the staff for the tremendous work that they did. Really garnering a significant amount of feedback, as David indicated, from the community and the time they've spent with staff and the community in developing the plan. I think we've got a good plan here that is aspirational and it will serve our community for a number of years.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we go around the horn real quick too before, in case anybody was having audio issues. Alderman Chevalier, anything to add?
No, I just think this plan looks really good. I appreciate your all of your all's input on this in putting this together for us. You guys hit it out of the park again. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Alderman Atkins.
I like the way it's put together. I like the presentation that we got in PDF. It's something we can give to the people out there that they can look and see, what's really going on and what it's going to take. So I do appreciate it.
Do we lose the mayor?
Mayor, do we still have you? Steve, you want to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any questions. I thought the plan looked really good.
All right, Alderman Yulidol.
I don't have anything to add.
Is that everybody? I miss anyone?
Alderman Hartman.
Oh yeah, well, Dan had talked a couple times. Yeah, Dan, do you have anything else
You
to
know,
add?
I just thank you, David. Great plan, great work. You hit out of the park. We're really glad that we're able to work with you. So thank you and your team.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you. Yeah, great to actually sort of track the vision through the comp plan into the Parks and Rec plan, right? And you know, I do think, if I could just kind of probably as a final comment, I think this is an opportunity, and you know, a couple of you mentioned this, is to really get the community to understand the reality of this. You know, we did try to. I mean, you can go into these kind of plans and say, oh, what do you want? And you know, we'll build you anything you want, right? But we did really try to make sure we managed expectations, and you know, and acknowledge the interests in some of these bigger things down the track, but also say, well, if you want that, here's what you got to do to get there, right? And this is how you build your local economy, how these pieces connect together. And that's really what we've focused on, I think, right through this, is how do we make this as synergistic as possible? And we hit those three sort of big outcome areas, you know, the community benefit, the environmental, ecological interest, and then, but the economic driver, right? So, because we really talk right from the visioning on that, the potential for recreation to be part of driving your downtown economy, which is really critical to a lot of small businesses and entrepreneurs in your community. So I think we kept people's head pretty straight on that on the way through. But I do think the plan, you know, should be exciting enough for people to say, well, you know, this is something I want to give some money and time to, right? And I think that's the point of really activating the community. Let's really push and test that, right? So, because that's, you know, that's the make or break for people, I think.
Yeah. David, as always, appreciate everything you do. Thanks for staying up late for us. I mean, it's not super late up there, but it's kind of late. Yeah, we appreciate it. Thank you very much. And we'll talk to you next time. Now we can kick it over to our 5-year CIP update. Bye, David.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Heather. Carissa. So, Stephen, are you leading this one since CIP or Cynthia? All right.
Yeah,
Chuck's on, so this should be a lot faster, right?
It shouldn't take an enormous amount of time to get through now, but we do have a lot to cover. So, yeah, I'll take you through the presentation tonight. Let me share my screen. Can you see the slide deck?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to come to you tonight and provide you with a 2021 CIP update and a look at the proposed 5-year capital improvement plan and projects that are planned for the next 5 years, with the emphasis on year 2022, our budget year. With me tonight is Bob and Alan. With Chuck being out of office, the board has technical questions on some of the projects as we go through them. We do have Bob and Alan on the participant list here to help provide any information on that. So with further ado, we'll get started and take a look at our proposed 5-year CIP. In addition, in the work session packet, I wanted to note there are CIP updates on all the projects that we are completing in this fiscal year. So there's information on current projects in the work session packet. So we'll start off tonight by looking at the CIP projects that are proposed in the general fund. Looking at our 5-year CIP from 2022 to 2026, one project which we talked a little bit about, talking about those revenue generators and making improvements in those areas, looking at finishing our electrical upgrades out at Smithsport Campground by combining both phase 2 and phase 3. Combining both of those phases together, we'll have a budget of about $75,000 for that project. And by combining those phases, we'll gain some efficiencies and costs and time of completion. So with that slated for 2022, we also have our GIS and asset management efforts. Chuck's been looking ahead to those efforts and making plans to start working on those items. And some of those costs we expect to expend this year, maybe about $25,000. And then next year, we have a total of $100,000 with a 50-50 split. 50,000 in the general fund and 50,000 in the water and sewer fund to help get that program up and running. And then in the next 5 years, we've allocated $40,000 each year to the vehicle and equipment replacement fund, and that'll help support our costs in the BRF that pay for our enterprise leased vehicles. And that'll continue to help us build our fleet up and get those vehicles replaced and help pay for leasing costs. I wanted to give you an update on how we're looking on our cash balance for the general fund. In the column that says fiscal year 21 original budget, those figures are the original budgets that were adopted by the board. So they don't indicate any budget amendments. But what they do show is the original plan for the general fund and how we thought we would finish the year. So you can see, if you skip to the bottom and look at the ending cash balance, we originally had budgeted to end the year with about 2.2 million. A few workshops ago, a few work sessions ago, we took a look at a budget update, and we talked about how sales tax was performing well, which has allowed us to bring in more projected revenues than budgeted. And we talked about some of the vacancy savings that we would incur. Both of those variables have allowed us to project a higher ending cash balance, which is in the yellow column. And so when you put it all together, we started this fiscal year with a higher cash balance than what we budgeted at about $3.5 million. We're expecting to bring in a little bit more revenue. In addition to the sales tax, tonight we have a budget amendment number 6, a first reading, which would bring remaining CARES funds into the general fund to help offset expense. And so we see a higher revenue projection now with those CARES funds included. The expenditures are still on track for the budget, even with the budget amendments. But together, those 3 variables are allowing us to bring a higher cash balance into fiscal year 21 than what we budgeted, a difference of about $1 million. We'll take that figure of 3.2 and we'll plug it into the first yellow bar there. This is our general fund 5-year fund balance forecast. The yellow bars signify our projected ending fund or cash balance as we work through each year. On the graph, the blue line represents your revenues and the orange line represents expenditures. So as we work through 2021, we'll expect to finish with about 3.2. Next year, with our preliminary budget set up the way it is, we're expected to eat in the fund balance a little bit. So as we continue to explore balancing the budget, we're going to look at the delta between those figures. As we work through the next few 3 to 4 years, 23 through 26, you'll see both expenses and revenues increase. We have standard increases in operating expenses with commodities and contractual services each year. And then below the graph, you see we do have long-term revenue assumptions plugged into the graph. They're fairly conservative assumptions, which is great for the model. And I think it allows us to consistently hit these revenue marks by using these assumptions. But hopefully we can bring in higher percentages. But we have a 1% annual growth in city sales tax and 2.5% growth in use tax. So I want to take these figures in yellow and we'll put them in this chart here, which shows us our 5-year required reserve analysis. At the top of the chart is the orange line that indicates the city's operating budget. And you'll see that continues to increase each year as those standard costs go up. As the operating budget increases, our financial policy also requires us to hold back a reserve of 40%. And that's indicated in the blue. So you see that blue number increase each year as the operating budget also increases, which allows us to hold the 40%. The item that Cynthia, Anna, and I really want to track in the future is that gap that gets closed between the yellow and the blue, which represents some of the excess cash or the cushion between the requirement and the ending fund balance. It's key to make sure we don't close in on that blue too much, and that we have a cushion in case we do have emergency infrastructure projects, other things that can come up that would allow us to continue to make sure we meet our reserve requirement. This is the pending 5-year CIP in the general fund. So these projects currently aren't included in the 5-year. You'll see, depending on the direction we go with the police building, our chief is working on a police study at the moment, as indicated by Cynthia in the previous work session when we talked about CARES funding and expenses. Depending on how we go with that police study, we could be looking at a reconfiguration in the city hall, or also an entire police department building, depending on what the study concludes. Other pending projects, in this year, I want to start exploring an upgrade to Encode 10 to see what kind of advantages that brings to our financial system and our HR system, our ERP. And then at the bottom, one of the signature projects that will certainly require some debt financing and likely the bond issuance being on the ballot is a streets and parks facility and constructing that building. And that's just a pretty rough cost estimate at $4 million. And Chuck has been working on the engineering efforts for that and closing in on the selection of a firm. With that, we'll transition and look at the transportation sales tax and see what this fund is going to give us in the next 5 years in terms of projects. Looking at fiscal year 22 on our 5-year CIP, we plug in $300,000 in that year to do asphalt overlay. And you can see as we work out through the columns, we have $300,000 allocated each year. In that 2022 fiscal year, we've put our $300,000 into overlay for Tillman Road that would take us from Highway 92 to 144th Street, and also $50,000 to complete Hospital Drive. Both of those projects have lower PCIs than many of the other roads in Smithville. I think PCIs in the mid 40s. And so those roads show up on this list for that reason, with having such low indices and poor condition. We also look to spend about $100,000 on the 4th Street Terrace road repairs after we complete utility improvements out there. And our utility improvements, we'll see that later on in the water and sewer fund slides. In the rest of the 5-year CIP, we've allocated engineering in 2023 for commercial street sidewalks. And then in the next year, we have, you'll see if you skip to the bottom row, construction costs of nearly $700,000 for the sidewalks, and then some offsetting revenue of $500,000 from a grant reimbursement. So together, those costs add up to about $500,000 in fiscal year 24. The Transportation Sales Tax Fund is in good shape financially for this year. We started this year with a higher cash balance than what we had originally budgeted. We're expecting to bring in more revenues with our sales tax performance. Our expenditures are higher than our original budget, so we've had to increase that with budget amendments, and that's due to finishing our streetscape project, our Streetscape East project, and then also some increased costs to the street maintenance overlay program and getting that set up. But we're still projecting to end with a good cash balance near $300,000, which is on track with our original budget. This is the fund balance forecast for the transportation fund. Again, expenditures in orange and revenues in blue. You can see that the model currently shows us holding about $300,000 to $350,000 as we work through each year in fund balance. So having that amount of money in fund balance is really beneficial to helping us with project overages. And as we talked about in Finance Committee, material costs have been going up. and projects have been tending to get more expensive. So having a good fund balance there is really helpful. In 2024, like we looked in the last slide with commercial streets, we'll get money back from Mark in the form of reimbursement, which boosts our blue line. And then we have the corresponding expenditures for the construction of the sidewalks. Our assumption on the model here is a 1% growth in transportation sales tax. So we'll watch to see if we continue to exceed that percentage. Here's our pending list for transportation sales tax. The idea with this list is as we do an annual update to the PCI, we can continue to plug these projects in. Remember, we have that $300,000 currently allocated for asphalt overlay. So Chuck and Alan can continue to evaluate the condition of these streets and get them plugged in each year as we update that PCI. We have over $2.1 million in pending projects right now on the sheet. And that doesn't count a couple at the bottom that are to be decided, like our Pope Lane connection back to Highway 169 and some seal coating, microsurfacing. If there's no questions so far on general fund or transportation, I'll move on to the capital improvement sales tax fund.
Any questions on this, anybody? Thanks for updating the picture.
Yeah, we got our streetscape east that's coming along real nicely. You go outside City Hall and you see they got the sidewalks laid down and they're getting ready to put brick in around the curbing. So it's really starting to come together here. They got some good weather to work on it. In our capital improvement sales tax fund, our proposed 5-year CIP includes the annual transfer to the debt service fund. We issued debt in 2018, 2019 for those series of debt, and we are obligated to pay those off until 2038 is how long the debt schedule takes us through on those annual payments. So that's our first priority, is to make sure we get those payments made. And from there, we can work with the fund in terms of the project. So next year, we'll look to embark on phase 3 of the downtown streetscape project and work with the north section through Bridge Street. We'll have engineering in 2022. And then in 2023, we'll look to complete the construction for about $600,000. Along with that, we're expecting to receive about $500,000 in Mark reimbursement. And then finally, below that, we're proposing to also allocate funding for the engineering of the downtown gateway sign and the construction of the sign. So 2023 will be a very big year for this fund as we look to get those projects done. In the out years, we don't have anything allocated yet, but we'll look here at the fund balance, how that plays out. This year in the fund, we started the year with more funds than what we had budgeted, so we look to be in good shape there. The revenues are performing well as sales tax, like I said in the previous slide, sales tax performing well. And then the streetscape project is getting completed this year, so we've had to budget those funds in fiscal year 21 via budget amendment. So we do see higher expenditures there. We do have a little bit lower ending cash balance than our original budget, that being because of the Main Street Trail project. We have to cover the project overage that we've incurred with that project through the sales tax. So Chuck and I are going to carefully monitor that project here as we start to finish it up and make sure we leave this fund with a good cash balance in positive here as we finish out the year. The forecast for this fund, we do run that down in 2021 pretty low. We'll monitor that as we finish out the year. In 2022, we have the annual transfer to debt service in our expense, and our revenues will allow us to build up fund balance. Like we said, in 2023, we had a lot of projects to do. So we'll see that fund balance come back down. You see the orange and the blue shoot up in 2023. And remember, there's the Mark grant reimbursement in the revenues there. And then the Streetscape North True Bridge Street project boosts our expense. And then in 2024, 5 and 6, we just have the annual debt service payment plugged in there, allows us to build that fund balance back up again. So we'll take some careful monitoring, make sure we can execute these projects in the next couple of years with the sales tax. It'd be great success to get through these next couple of years using these funds to complete those projects. Our pending list, again, like I said, we don't have anything on there at the moment. I'll move on to the debt service fund, which really is an in and out fund. Like I said, in the next 5 years, the money that we pull from the capital improvement sales tax will pay for our annual debt service payment. So we have those payments listed through here, and we'll continue to make those payments on the debt through 2038. The debt service fund works exactly like we budget. The money comes in and the money goes out just as planned. There's no variance in revenues or expenses. It's pretty simple there. And the fund balance forecast here, the one remark I'll make here is you'll see we do have about $250,000 in ending fund balance. That allows us to make an additional payment if we're going to issue more debt. It just gives us that extra ability if we did need to make a payment here in the future that we can pull from that fund. Any questions on capital improvement or debt before I move on to park? Okay, so we just got done talking about the parks master plan. So these two slides will look pretty familiar. The next 5 years, at this time, we'll get this updated now that we have the plan and gotten some input on the plan. We've put $150,000 aside for annual park projects in terms of expenditures. Those projects are still to be decided, but as staff will start looking at that plan and the plan that David talked about and start plugging those in. On the stormwater side, we've got $150,000 budgeted for next year to complete a stormwater master plan. And then from there, we'll have $100,000 allocated for stormwater projects from fiscal year 23 to 26. As we look at the fund balance for the park and stormwater sales tax, you'll see in actual expenditures there in orange are lower than our revenues. That's going to allow us to build up a fund balance year over year. You'll see the fund balance increases from about $300,000 to $400,000 each year with our 1% annual growth assumption. The next slide here accounts for some of the strategy that David and Matt talked about in the Parks Master Plan slide deck. As we work through each year, the plan would be to earmark about $300,000 of our fund balance as it grows to help pay for that large park project. And so together with some of our fundraising efforts and the legacy fund, we can couple those monies with the fund balance that we've saved up to complete that large park project, while also getting some of the smaller parks done, neighborhood park work that was discussed in the plan. Any questions on that before we move to the water and wastewater fund? Okay. So this fund can get a little bit complicated. So if you do have questions, please let me know as we move through these slides. But I'm hoping with some of these graphics that it can be a little bit easier to understand how the funds are used and build on some of the work that Dan had shared with you in the past when we looked at this fund. I want to start with how we started the year in fiscal year 21 in terms of the cash balance. You'll see this figure, 4.5 million, located in the CAFR in the financial statement. But the breakdown of this money is shown in the green, blue, and yellow bars. So starting at the bottom, we have a cash balance of about 2.6 million in terms of the combined water and wastewater cash. That's built out of the sales of water and wastewater and the fixed charges and volume charges that people pay through their utility bills. And that's the money that we use to be able to fund personnel costs and daily operational costs, repairs to water lines, fixing breaks, those sorts of things. The blue and the green represent the water and sewer impact cash. The water impact cash can be used for water impact projects. And so we'll use that money to complete projects that help alleviate or work towards reducing impact on our system, and the same with sewer. So we'll start with that fund balance in 2021, and you see that there in the yellow cell. As we look at the original budget and what's projected, we have a big difference between revenues and expenses there. We have done budget amendments to increase our fiscal year 21 budget as we complete the raw water pump station and some of these larger projects. One of the reasons we do see a difference in the ending fund balance is the difference between the 1.6 and the 3.7 is our ARPA funds that we're expecting to receive in the upcoming summer months. Those ARPA funds, which Cynthia talked to you about in the work session last time, are going to be used towards the raw water pump station. We'll look at that in a little bit. That is one of the major factors between what we had budgeted in an ending cash balance and what we're projecting. Those ARPA funds are going to help us retain more in our ending cash balance than what we had originally budgeted. Here's a breakdown of our ending cash position in fiscal year 21. The big item here that you see change is the blue bar. The water impact cash is expected to decrease from that 1.2 to the 300,000. The reason for that decrease is using water impact cash on the raw water pump station project. It's on tonight's agenda to get that project going with Urban Built. And so part of the project will be funded through water impact cash, which would then be reduced. And then part of the project will be used in ARPA funds. We have about $1 million in water impact fees that would be used for the project. And so that reduces the water impact cash here on the graph. I'll take you through the water and wastewater proposed CIP here. We start out in fiscal year 22 with some improvements. We'll finish up our engineering for the raw water pump station. We'll also look to do 4th Street and 4th Terrace construction and water improvements. We have other projects like a floating aerator, cleaning the lagoon, putting in a new HVAC system, continuing the GIS asset management efforts, UV lights, and then also at the bottom we have costs plugged in for 144th Street in the Forest Oaks project down south. And we'll have I think we'll have a special work session and special attention on that project in the budget process as we move forward. The next slide here is really key to looking at our 5-year forecast for the fund. As we move to fiscal year 23, which would be a couple budget cycles away, the work on Forest Oaks there is a plug number of $2.5 million as we continue to work through that project and evaluate the options. This is where the fund starts to lose some of its cash balance and float below the required reserve. I'll show that to you in the next slide. We start to spend more on projects in 2023. You can see there with the water plant expansion. And then as you move to 25 and 26, that's certainly where the fund would experience a severe cash fall without doing some debt financing as we look to do the water plant expansion. So moral of the story here is we have a lot of big projects on the horizon. And as we look at what that does to fund balance, you can see there in 2023, it starts to reduce the fund balance. And so depending on how we approach that project, we're going to have to establish a timeline for debt financing and look to get that project funded so that we can retain an adequate amount of reserves. You can see there, if we were to pay for cash, which is not possible with the water plant construction, the fund balance would certainly fall well below negative. So again, that project's going to have to require debt financing. We can't complete those projects with cash. This is the required reserve analysis. So in 2022, the operating budget's about $3.5 million. We're required to hold about 20% of that amount in reserves so that we can maintain enough funds to go about our operations. The reserve level sits at about $700,000. So At this time, we can afford projects that are listed on the fiscal year 22 column. But again, when we start looking at the Forest Oaks project and looking beyond, that's where we're going to probably have to establish a timeline for debt financing. So we'll work with Cynthia and Anna to do that. You can see the fund balance there in 23 falls below the operating percentage. And then, as we said, it falls well into the negative. So that'll be how we look at those projects going forward. We can't meet our reserve levels if we were to try to pay cash in 2023 on that project, and depending on the cost estimate of the project.
And Stephen, if I could jump in for just 1 second, we noted in the memo, and this has been something that we have talked about since last summer in developing the CIP. We need to ensure some dedicated time, and staff over the next couple of months are really going to be drilling into water and sewer, looking at that south project, determining alternatives, the best possible recommendation to bring forward to the board, and then the impact that has on the fund over the long term, and working with our financial advisors in determining, given a revised or a review of these costs and cash balances, where we stand on debt, when is the best time and how much to issue debt for. We will also be looking at rate information. So we have anticipated, in addition to discussion of what happens on the south side, we will also look at the entirety of the water and combined water and wastewater fund in August to really intensively look at that with the board.
Yeah. Thanks, Cynthia, for that addition. That helps explain the timeline better. Yeah.
Marv's got his hand up.
Is there any grant writing opportunities on this?
There's not a lot because we are not a struggling city.
Okay.
Most of the sewer water type stuff is for cities that can't get financing and other opportunities. We can go out and get we can get certificate of participation money pretty much anytime. We have debt rolling off in November. We have a good bond rating. We have good revenues. We're a growing city. It's really tough for us to be able to be eligible for that kind of stuff.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Trust me, I've looked at that one, Marv, every which way I can.
And Marv, we'll also be talking about rate impact, and we'll look at our rates compared to other rates in the area, and ways that we could look at that as well. Some of the members of the board will remember that we did a rate study in 2018, and with that had the first increases in water and sewer rates in really kind of historical memory for many people around town. So one of the things that, because we have so many ongoing infrastructure needs, both to address growth, but also just to maintain our existing and aging infrastructure, we need to ensure constant level of funding to address those. So one of the pieces of the puzzle we'll be looking at is rates compared to other communities, both water, sewer, and then looking at the impact fee charges as well to help with that new growth. So really over the next 2 months, we will do an intensive review of all, we're gonna look at this from all sides.
Yeah, and for those of you that were here and those of you that knew, when we did the rate study, we had the water master plan, but not the wastewater master plan. So that gave us a lot more insight into what we're going to have to pay for in the future. So now if we go back out and do a new rate study, they'll be able to tell us, hey, this is where you're competitive, or you're way below everyone else, but also you won't be able to pay your debt if you don't, right? Like that was one of the things that they gave us the last time, is if we don't do anything with rates, and we take out debt, we may not be able to pay our debt. So we have to look at all those different angles. Isn't sewer and water fun? I wish we could just build parks. Can we just build parks? Cool stuff.
It's challenging to get the timeline established for all this work and get them completed, that's for sure. This is the last bit that I want to take you through on this fund is the pending 5-year CIP. So we have about $13 million in estimated project cost here that sits outside of the 5-year CIP. You'll see there, based upon population growth, we have gravity lines for Owens Branch set aside. And then at the bottom, one of the other big projects is the construction of another water treatment plant for $4 million. So there's some future needs that are beyond 2026 that we'll continue to look at and track those costs on. I want to take you through the water impact fees and the sewer impact fees. So you remember from the first slide, we saw we had water and sewer impact cash. These are the projects that are specifically allocated for those fees. In fiscal year 21, it's not pictured on the slide, but I mentioned earlier, we'll use about $1 million of water impact fees to help pay for the raw water pump station in conjunction with the ARPA funds. And then in fiscal year 22, we'll look to spend about $150,000 to complete a water loop system at the Diamond Crest subdivision. Here's the water impact fees fund balance slide. So like we saw in the first slide, we saw the reduction of the water impact fees from 1.2 down to about 300,000 by using those to pay for the raw water pump station. We'll enter fiscal year 22 with a fund balance of about 305. We'll have revenues of about $200,000. You can see the blue lines at the maybe $175,000 mark. And then we'll complete the loop system project. At that point, we don't have any other projects set for water impact fees. So staff, as we continue to evaluate the 2023 to 2026 timeframe and work through those projects, we'll look to see what can be used with water impact fees and what the strategy is there. On the sewer impact fee side, at this moment, we don't have anything proposed in our 5-year CIP for using sewer impact fees. There are some monies available with sewer impact fees depending on the strategy the board would like to take and staff's recommendations. We're looking to finish this year with about $915,000. We expect sewer impact fees to bring in about $200,000 a year with the blue line at the 200 mark. So as we work through the next 5 years, without any projects allocated at this time, we do see a fund balance grow in sewer impact fees. But again, it's open to strategy and board direction and staff recommendations and a combination of those things to see what we can do with these monies in terms of paying for future projects. The last fund here I want to discuss is the funds that will be provided through the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Cynthia Honor and I have been communicating about these funds and trying to work through when they would be received by the city. I've been in contact with a couple individuals from the state of Missouri, and it's really all dependent on a couple of factors. First, when the state of Missouri actually receives those funds, which in looking through some emails today, they haven't received those funds yet. And then when the governor decides to release those funds to all the local government entities and all the entities that will receive the funds. And so it's dependent on those two factors as to when those funds get to the city of Smithville. Hopefully here in the next 1 to 3 months, we're looking to receive those funds. But as we get more information, I'll keep everyone updated. And I'm sure Cynthia will keep us updated too with her staff reports. Here's the table on the ARPA revenues and how we would spend those funds. We're expected to bring in about $2 million in ARPA funds. That figures from Cynthia's staff report last meeting. Below, you'll see the raw water pump station project, which is on the regular agenda session for tonight, up for approval to approve that contract and get that project going. That project cost is about $3 million, and ARPA would pay for about $2 million of that project. And then below, you'll see we talked about water impact fees being able to help pay for about $1 million. So the strategy here would be, as we start on that project, we would initially begin using the $1 million in water impact fees in this fiscal year. And then when we have those ARPA funds available, we begin to spend those funds after we've completed the spending on the water impact fees. And so that allows us to use those impact fees, and then when the ARPA funds all become available, use those as they hit our accounts. And that concludes the presentation for tonight on the CIP update and the proposed 5-year plan. Are there any other questions on the board about any of the projects or fund balances or anything at this point?
Alderman Atkins.
The ARPA funds, are them guaranteed? You got guaranteed numbers on that?
I think Cynthia's welcome to jump in, but I think that is a conservative estimate at this point. We've seen some fluctuated numbers fluctuate between this number of 1.988 and up to close to 2.2. But we want to plug in a conservative number at this point so that we know we can hit our project costs and have the revenue to do it.
Marv, the bill has passed. It passed back in March. The allocations, like Stephen said, we have seen 2 different allocations, one early on and one as recently as a couple of weeks ago, that, as Stephen noted, 1.9 to 2.2 are the numbers we're looking at. So my comfort level is to estimate it about the 2 million amount.
No doubt. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, Mark. Yeah, want to make sure we can pay for this project even if we do receive a lower amount than what's estimated, and we have that plan with the water impact fees. So,
And is the plan, Cynthia, is the plan still we're getting that in 2 payments?
That is our understanding. That's the way it's written. We, as Stephen indicated, we have had conversations with folks at the state. There's not really a good plan for how to allocate that, but the letter of the law reads that cities will receive 2 allocations. The first round should be within 90 days of passage of the law, is the way the law is written now, how long it takes to roll out from the state, and then the second payment a year after that. The funds have to be expended. The first portion, funds have to be allocated by 2024 or spent.
yeah, 2024.
Yeah. So we'll follow that process. And as soon as, like Stephen said, as soon as we get information from the State Department of Revenue or State Department of Treasury, wherever it's coming from, we'll keep you all advised. And when we know that amount, we'll let you know.
Yeah. We, and like you guys said, this is on the agenda for tonight. We know the amount, so it's a big construction project, just like all the sewer ones. I can't see everyone on the screen, so if you have something, just unmute and speak up. When Stephen's sharing the slides, I can't see. There you go. That works.
So Cynthia, are you looking for ideas from the board for ways to, try to squeeze things in, or what? I mean, what kind of direction are you looking for tonight?
So staff is bringing forward this plan as recommendations for the next 5 years, and want to have board's input. Does this make sense? Like you said, John, are there other projects you would rather see? We've got finite resources in each of the funds. So basically what we've done in each of the funds, tried to look at board priorities and existing plans with those priorities that outline those, as well as staff review, including pavement condition index for transportation projects and that sort of thing. So yes, what we're looking for from the board this evening is feedback as to the plan as outlined, if this looks like something that makes sense and addresses the board's goals and priorities, or are there things you'd like us to take a look at? Because this is the first view of the CIP that will be presented as part of the 2022 budget, and we present that later this fall.
Yeah, and I know you said we'll have a work session on it. The only thing I just want to see drop off the list is the Forest Oaks sewer. It's getting more and more expensive, and for a few folks. So as that develops, 144th Street south of that sells, and somebody wants to put sewer in, great. But running sewer for that long, when we're having to go out and get easements and take people to court, it just seems like we spend those funds other places.
I agree, Mayor. Question I do have for Cynthia and maybe Stephen is, these are our priorities and we've absolutely got to address the priorities. There's no doubt. Is there kind of a medium set of priorities and a lower set of priorities that you guys have on your agenda that we could see or talk about at some point? Doesn't have to be tonight.
I guess I'm not sure. The plan that's presented really kind of outlines the prioritization of the projects, so that the earlier projects funded are those we see as higher priorities given the funding levels that we've got. And then as you work through the 5-year plan, those priorities work out, and then kind of the lowest priorities are those on the unfunded list.
Makes sense. No, that's right. There would be. I guess then the final question is, what if something comes up as an emergency? Can we, as a board, shuffle that to help address those priorities?
Absolutely. That's what we look at. As Stephen indicated, and Stephen and Anna Myra and I had a conversation today. You know, we the board has a policy in the general fund of a 40% fund balance, and we have significantly over that. Given that, we were able to cash fund infrastructure emergency really 2 years ago when Amory Road sloughed off the side right after construction had finished. And we were able to fund that in that way. If we would not have had that excess reserve, we would have been looking at what projects would have to be pushed back. So yes, those are exactly what would happen, and staff would bring recommendations to all as to what we see as makes sense. You know, there are a lot of things that come into that recommendation, and a lot of projects depend on each other. So that's the beauty of a capital improvement plan, is it outlines those goals, and it really focuses on those interconnectivity of projects too.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, with being a capital improvement plan, you know, in the next 5-year phase, we'll look at 2023 through 2027 being our 5-year chunk. And so the board has all that flexibility in it being a plan to maybe shuffle some projects around or re-examine a pending list, and maybe pull something out or put something in. You know, that flexibility is there with a plan, and depending on the direction given by the board, then we can look at our forecasts and see if the project's feasible when we plug it into the plan, and what the revenues and expenses look like. So just that added support there, you know, if you're looking at doing that.
Yeah, and Stephen makes a good point, and as a reminder to us all, you all only budget for 1 year. When we bring the budget forward, you adopt a budget for funds for the next fiscal year. The CIP is a guide in helping us think through the years following that. It just helps us think about those longer term items. And so those can be shifted as things change as well.
Yeah. And I like what we've done with the asphalt overlay of just throwing that placeholder in there and not committing to any specific projects, because like you said, a road could fall off tomorrow and we got to go fix it. Get some big cracks in a certain part of town, you never know. So.
But then the other thing too is we have that PCI that helps us understand where we need to direct our resources as well. So we have those lists in the chute, and we'd like, our best priority would be able to address those as outlined in that way. But when we have those emergencies, then that's when we have to shift our thinking.
Well, and then we also, next year, we're going to have to reshift the CIP a little bit too, once we get the transportation master plan delivered.
Right. That's correct.
And Mayor, would stuff like the trails and connectivity like that, is that stuff going to be what we would wait on to determine how that looks?
I think that's going to bubble up in the transportation master plan,
Okay.
and we really need to put, you know, that we have that meeting this week, right?
Yeah.
Or next, yeah. So make sure we
sum up something like that.
Yeah, make sure we really focus on, if the north zone is going to be our community residential area, we really focus on getting trails there before we go in the dense, you know, south end that's not developed, right? Like from W Highway down to 180th Street where we built a trail, and then you get into the county trail system. You know, we've already kind of locked in what the housing is going to look like there for the next 10 years with the comp plan. We're not going to go build much else up there. So focusing on connectivity up there is more important than maybe, you know, 132nd to 150th Street, right? So
yeah, that's kind of what I was leading to. You know, I know it might be early to really talk about this, but I mean, if we can kind of have some early looks at what that trail system would look like, that would be great. Cause yeah, I mean, I just know with the more residences coming online, and just, you know, we're going to have more and more folks trying to use Old F Highway, right, as a way to get around. You know, we may not want that. So
Roundabout should slow them down a little bit.
but that there's just some, I mean, it's on the internet, right? But there's some pretty bad commentary this past week, you know, people really getting, you know, upset about bikes being on the road, you know, and why we keep adding trails, but bikes are still out there. But I mean, people don't realize that, you know, you still can't get to places throughout town. I mean, yes, you can get to the lake in downtown now, and, you know, to a certain extent through some other ways, but I mean, the vast majority of the north folks, there's no trail for them to successfully navigate.
Right. And as the mayor indicated, that is a significant piece. The beauty of having David involved in the transportation master plan and advising that as well, he understands that focus through the process and has been involved in Parks and Recreation as well, and knows that we kind of punted on the trails from Parks and Recreation so that it was really included as part of the transportation master plan, so that it could be part of the transportation network as we develop that north, south, and east-west connections both.
Yeah, and the cycling thing is not a unique situation to Smithville. Kansas passed their 3 feet law, but people still get hit. People are still putting pool noodles on the back of their bikes so people know what 3 feet looks like. There's a lot of technology now that takes a lot of video and pictures when you're riding your bike for people to get a little too close. So, but yeah, I understand. Trust me, I've had too many close calls with cars on my bike. Anyone else? Stephen, thanks for using colors we can all understand.
No problem.
Thanks, Stephen.
I do, if I could, Mayor, want to thank Stephen. I really appreciate the comparison data that he provided and the information that really outlines for us what our fund balances look like and the cash position will be in over time. And I think that helps a lot. Stephen has, as I mentioned earlier, we met on some other budget issues earlier today. And Stephen really has taken the forecasting to the next level for our, all of our budget information. So really appreciate his efforts.
Yeah. And it's difficult to project those impact fees, I know, because we've got, you know, commercial that could come in anytime, or housing that could come in, and housing that drops off. You know, we had something drop off planning and zoning last week. We had stuff get, you know, the number of lots changed. So those are hard to project, but we're going in the right direction. So.
Yeah, Mayor, just some quick math from that dropping off last week, you know, and impact fees, if you just take an average number that we have, just under $2 million from that one housing development dropping off. I mean, that's pretty significant impact fees.
Yeah, and hopefully we make it up in some of these commercial projects that are coming in. And I don't know, Cynthia, if you had this in your report, or Stephen or anybody, but we did get preliminary numbers from Clay County on our assessors. And I think this is probably, I don't have all the historical, but we were very close on residential new construction and commercial new construction this year. Residential beat it out by like $100,000. I mean, it was close. And we haven't even gotten everything up that's been agreed upon already, right? That's just the stuff that went up prior to the end of the year.
Right. Yeah, we've not done a deep dive on that. We'll I think we got, was it today or yesterday? It was late yesterday we got the information. I just haven't been able to dive into that, but yeah, that'll be. Yeah.
But John knows from planning and zoning and others that attend planning and zoning, we've had a lot of commercial permits and not a ton of residential permits. So we can't bank on 100 houses every year for impact fees.
That's correct.
We got redevelopment, right? I mean, I know, Dan, you've got clients and people that have really redeveloping and taking down one house and replacing it with multiples, and that, you know, that adds more meters, more services, all those different things. So All right. Well, I guess we get a break. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn till our 7 o'clock.
So moved.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I second.
All in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. See y'all in 25 minutes or so.
And we're on the same Zoom.
Yep. We just hang out here. Make sure you mute, turn off your video.